button to get your brains going.
Dr. Reed, Representative Reed, you are live now.
Gotcha. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is a special event hosted by the Outreach and Advocacy Committee for the DC State Board of Education. This morning, in lieu of our usual meeting, we are hosting a sexual assault panel to address the recent resolution that the DC State Board of Education passed. We have several agency as well as community partners in place to kind of help us do a deep dive into the issue of sexual assaults in and around schools and what could possibly be the role of the State Board of Education, as well as how we can make some partnerships so that we can ensure that students can commute and be in school safely as many ways as possible. I will now turn our agenda over to our president of the State Board of Education, Jessica Sutter, to bring greetings and also state the occasion. So President Sutter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us this morning for this important conversation. I really appreciate Dr. Reed for keeping the eyes of the board on this important issue. Dr. Reed and Representative Chang, who represents Ward 2, both had incidents at schools in their wards earlier this year regarding instances of sexual assault and sexual misconduct. And as they tried to support their constituents in learning more about what happened, in better understanding and in figuring out how to support students and families, they ran up against a lot of roadblocks. And some of those roadblocks involved being able to simply get information on what happened. We discussed as a result of those conversations, sort of the tensions that exist with this particular topic in dealing with privacy for victims, with privacy for minor children who are involved in situations, and the complexities around the topic of sexual assault and sexual abuse in schools. We also realize there's a lot that we as a board want to know and learn more about in order to be able to better advocate on behalf of students, families, and communities. So we passed a resolution that Dr. Reed proposed to the board. We also realized as part of that resolution that it would be helpful for the board to spend some time learning and becoming educated on the topic, understanding what agencies have responsibilities with respect to students and families in these and schools in these instances, what agencies have data, what data is able to be shared publicly, what is not able to be shared publicly and why, and how this is all communicated to members of the public, ideally before any individual child or their family has to experience this this sort of information personally. So I want to give gratitude to Dr. Reed for pushing this issue and to making sure the board stayed focused on it. I want to say thank you to our agency and community partners for being here today. And I'll end with this. We know in education that if we don't measure things, they don't get done. So for me, one of the key things I'm hoping to learn out of this is how do we get our hands around the amount of information that we know to understand the scope of the problems around sexual misconduct, sexual assault, sexual abuse as it relates to children in our schools, so that we can better understand ways to prevent these kind of instances in the future and to support young people when they experience such things. Thank you all for your time this morning. I'm eager to listen and learn.
Thank you, President Sutter. So what we have the questions that are in the chat, but I think because we have a decent sized group, we'll do a quick round robin just to do everyone introducing themselves and just kind of a quick overview of how you connect to the work before we get into the deep dive in our questions, okay? And I'm just gonna go by who I see on my screen, so it might look different on your screen. But I first see Serena Hayes, our DC Ombudsman for Public Education.
Hi, good morning. I'm Serena Hayes, the Education Ombudsman in the district. My office really works to support families and schools who are engaged in conflict, where an education-related barrier is present. And we work as an impartial or third-party neutral to help to resolve that conflict, so that the students and families are connected to the resources in order to get to resolution. In some of our cases, a very small number, but a few of our cases do involve instances of sexual assault.
Thank you. I'm going now to ANC Commissioner Krepp.
Hi, my name is Denise Krepp. I'm the ANC Commissioner for 6B10, and I'm here on the call because I have the information that you guys want. I'm the one that FOIA DCPS, so I have 10 years worth of DCPS data. I have the sexual assault settlement information that Carl Racine entered into, and I have the U.S. Attorney information, and I have some other bits and pieces. So that's why I'm here, is to share what I've got, and I've collected it over the past 8 years, and I've done it, by the way, and I'm going to say this because I'm really pissed off on a Friday morning. I did it and the DC Council did not do it. I noticed that nobody here from the DC Council is on, and nobody here from DCPS is on either. I had to FOIA them as an elected official. So shame on the DCPS for not being here, and shame on the DC Council. With that, happy Friday, and I look forward to sharing everything that I've done over the past 8 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Krupp. I will say the DC Council may have been an oversight on our end of who we invited, but that is great that we can actually send them our resolution, I believe, at some point. But that is great. Make sure we'll definitely ping them in. But thank you for taking the lead on FOIAing that information over the years, because it definitely helps set a tone that we had no idea that you've been collecting data that long. So thank you so much for that. Moving now to Tammy Hogan for the DC Rape Crisis Center. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, my name is Tammy Hogan, and I'm the clinical director at DC Rape Crisis Center. So our services include counseling, we have advocacy, and our hotline, and crisis intervention across all 3 programs looks a little different. But we have on-site crisis intervention, and we also have hotline crisis intervention. And then it's also a part of our counseling and advocacy. And our services start at 11 years old and go up.
Thank you for that. Dan Davis, our Chief Student Advocate.
Good morning. My name is Dan Davis. I'm the Chief Student Advocate in the Office of the Student Advocate. Our office helps students and families navigate both our charter and traditional public schools, and we help them get to a solution through wherever issue that comes up.
Great, Dan. You want to mention how you connect, or your office connects to the work?
Yeah, so for the past few years, we have been doing a lot of work around student safety and state passage. And for the past, since before the pandemic, we've been convening surveys and focus groups with students about their experiences getting to and from school. And so we have some data and some information I can share about those students' experiences. And when families do contact our office, a small number of those cases have a nexus with inappropriate conduct or inappropriate touching.
Thank you for that. Now going to Raina Bailey Smith from CFSA.
Good morning, Raina Bailey Smith, Program Administrator for Child Protective Services Investigations, where we, of course, investigate allegations of abuse and neglect. Not a sexual assault, of course, but we do have an institutional abuse unit that does respond to DCPS reports. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I see my colleague, Ward 1 Representative Emily Gasley has joined. Do you want to introduce yourself and any quick comments related to the work, Emily?
Sure. As Representative Reed mentioned, I'm Emily Gasley. I'm the Ward 1 rep on the state board. I'm also a longtime educator, and I started as a classroom teacher. The school that I actually was a co-founder of in Boston has gone through a horrible court case and is actually being closed. This is a lot of drama. I didn't actually intend to bring this up, but partly around accusations of sexual assault by a 5-year-old. This is so for me, this is somewhat personal, and also it brought up for me the question of, for educators and school leaders, what should they be reporting when, to whom? And I know there's rules around it, but sometimes it gets murky. And so part of the reason we're having this panel is because in the committee, we had sort of an in-depth conversation about how it can be complicated at the school level, definitions of, and, age of children and all of those things. So that's why we're really glad to hear from all of you. So I'll mainly just be listening. And also I've worked with teachers here in DC, and of course, want to make sure that our kids are protected and that they know, when they should go and speak to an adult and report when they are being abused. So I think all of that is sometimes seems really clear, and when it's actually happening to the victim or when adults hear it, it's less clear. So that's what we're hoping to get a little more clarity around today.
Thank you, Representative Gasley. So we'll get into the first question, which is, and again, we'll kind of move through our questions and then kind of close out with any final statements. The first question is, and again, to set tone, this is for the State Board of Education to, one, educate ourselves on what resources are out there, what policies are out there, and then also identify where the gaps are. So the first question is, what sexual assault policies are in place at your agency or program? For those of you who may not have an agency or program, if you know of any policies that aren't stated or have any ideas related to policy, happy to hear that. So I will open up the floor.
So why don't I start from the agency level? And can I break down some stuff that I've been discovering?
Sure.
Okay. So when I said that I was requesting information, when I started asking for information about 5 years ago, I thought I was asking for information at the K through 12 level at one entity, and I learned that was the wrong approach. So if you're looking for K through 12 info on sexual assault, first you got to break it into a couple of buckets. You have to break it into the bucket of DCPS. So DCPS takes DCPS children. Then you have to break it into the charter board because they take the second bucket. And then the third bucket is the religious schools, like the Catholic schools here in DC. So they each have different policies. Now, I, as an elected official, can ask for information from DCPS, and that's how I was able to successfully FOIA them. So it took a while, but I was able to get the information out of DCPS. And DCPS has about 50% of the students here in DC. I've never successfully obtained the information from the charter board because the charter board was always telling me, hey, while we theoretically have oversight, we don't know what's going on school by school. So when you ask the question of what's going on, you have to then ask the question of, does that person who you're asking have full knowledge? And at least at the charter level in DC, they don't. That information is still being stovepiped at the school by school level. So that's the charter school. And then if you look at the religious side, again, that's also stovepipe. I, as an elected official, have never been able to gain the information on the Catholic schools. And I'm Catholic, by the way. So yes, I do take an interest in what's going on in the Catholic schools. So break it apart into those buckets. And then what you have to do is say, okay, are those policies being implemented? I would argue that what was going on at DCPS was they may have had certain policies and procedures, but they weren't necessarily following them, or they weren't notifying. So what I was finding is that incidents were occurring, and sometimes people were reporting them to MPD, but sometimes they weren't. And when they did notify MPD, how did they notify MPD? And I say MPD because a crime, and sexual assault is a crime, can only be prosecuted if you notify MPD. But if your policy says you don't notify MPD, you notify DCPS leadership, well, then does DCPS leadership notify MPD? I mean, you've got to pull on several different strings. And I say all of that because the information that I was successful in gaining this past June showed me a couple of things. I asked a couple of questions. I asked for information on 10 years worth of data for teachers and employees that had been fired for sexual assault, that had been placed on administrative leave for sexual assault, and that had been prosecuted for sexual assault. And they were able to pull all of that. But then the next question I had was, all right, if you know prosecution, do you know if there were any prosecutions that actually happened? And what I was being told by DCPS is they didn't know. So I went to Carl Racine's office here in DC and said, do you know if any of the schools where we've had problems, 10 years worth of incidents, were prosecuted? And they said, and I quote, I don't know. So Carl Racine's office is not keeping track of the sexual assaults that are occurring here in DC schools. That's the U.S. Attorney's Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office has refused consistently to share what crimes they're prosecuting. But then go back to Racine's office, His office is keeping track of the settlements. Now, why do I bring that up? Because you can prosecute crimes or you can enter into settlement agreements. And the city did enter into at least one settlement agreement, and I believe it was for $75,000, involving a male teacher and a male student. So that's also occurring. It's a lot of information. I realize it's complicated, but I encourage people to kind of pull the threads on all of that when you start looking at policies and procedures.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on policies and procedures that your office may have or that you are aware of related to sexual assault in schools?
I mean, I can add that that's basically all we do. And our policies are set up to be trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and survivor-centered across the board. And we do work with ages 11 on up. In our counseling program, our advocacy is different. That's 18 and older. But all of our policies are designed for that. So maybe if you wanted something more specific, you can ask, but I could talk the entire 2 hours about it.
I'm sure, and unfortunately, but I am curious when you mentioned your policies are culturally responsive, 3 other things. Can you mention, or I guess give us concrete examples of what does that look like in regards to how do you create culturally responsive policies related to the topic? And then I should have had the paper, but those things.
No, I mean, they're at this point, keywords that a lot of people use, but in terms of what that looks like for survivor-centered, it's empowerment and choice. So survivors get to determine how they want the services to the extent that we're not limited by our funding. Because we are a crisis center, we are time limited in our services in terms of number of sessions. For our advocacy, which don't include youth, that's held by another agency in the area. But for 18 and older, that's indefinite. Our advocacy, it comes out of the SAVR legislation for services. And then our hotline, you can call it anonymous and confidential. So survivor centered, the choice is, do you want to share or not share? That's not allowed on our hotline, but everywhere else in terms of what we need to know about you is only, a point of contact in terms of that, and everything else you determine what you share and what we have in terms of being culturally responsive. We have rigorous training from everybody, includes administration, not just direct service providers within the agency, have to go through rigorous training in terms of biases, implicit bias. All of our services are through an anti-oppressive lens. So given the fact that sexual assault is about power, it's not about sex, and it's about your power being taken away, and all forms of oppression are linked. So bias training in terms of implicit bias, all of that is very rigorous in our agency. So you understand the power dimensions or the power differentials in terms of engaging with survivors, because power, understanding that is paramount. And you can't look at that, in a vacuum. You have to look at it in terms of how it intersects with someone's identity, in terms of the disempowerment that they've experienced up until that point and subsequent, in terms of service delivery, in terms of interactions, and all of that. So that's considered. I'm trying to say it in a non-technical way, also, just for everybody that's listening, depending on where they are. And then in terms of being trauma-informed, it's looking at everything through a trauma-informed lens. So everything that someone says or how they present, it's also a way to sort of eliminate bias, is to realize that someone is going through a trauma response. So in one sort of example would be in school. If someone's acting out and something is happening, you're not going to look that as like a pathology or a behavioral issue. You're not going to look that as some sort of delinquency. You're going to look at that in terms of the community violence that they may be experiencing and witnessing. So trauma can happen just from witnessing violence. It doesn't have to be necessarily where you're the primary victim. And so we consider all of that on all different macro, meso, and micro lenses in what someone experiences. And then that sort of symptomology or what they're experiencing it's viewed as a sort of trauma response. And so we intervene in a way that's supportive and understanding, anti-oppressive, and all of that. If that sort of answers your question. I could also go on and talk about this a lot too.
That does, Tammy. I think I'm happy, and I'm actually, I know this idea came from our Vice President, Ebony Rose Thompson, because of just how much we don't know. We also don't know who all our agency partners are, who our community partners, and then what you all know. So I immediately, my gut reaction is, whatever our next steps are related to the topic, I'm definitely leaning on you all, because everything that you mentioned, especially about like responses and letting the victim lead or the individual lead in regards to what outcomes they want to see, were kind of related to at least the one incident that I was aware of in Ward 8 in the spring of the victim was asking for relocation of schools, and the parent was asking for support, and we were kind of all like, where do we go for this? So that was helpful framing for sure. I'm going to go to at least.
Can I add?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one last thing that I think is really important in terms of these decisions that are being made too, is whoever the messenger is, understanding that power differential. So my being white privilege that I have, and coming in and even having the conversation, understanding where that bias is and where my privilege is, and then my response in terms of providing support on any of those levels. So also whoever the facilitator is, the messenger is, the provider is, understanding where your power and privilege is. My clinical privilege, even if I'm sitting with someone that's white, I still have privilege over, which is power over. And that can set the tone of any conversation and any kind of support.
Thank you so much for centering that. Much appreciated. Raina, I'm going to hop over to you, because I would imagine Child and Family Services and then the Protective Services Division has some policies laid out related to the topic. So like for you to chime in if you can.
No problem. Thank you. So because we view assault as a criminal matter, we do have a process if it's reported through our hotline. So our hotline staff is trained to gather the information and review any databases or our database to make sure that we can provide any information that would inform past history or anything, demographic information. And then we have a portal that is a direct line to the Youth and Family Services Division of MPD, and then we just transfer the investigation over to them and let them pick it up there. And that's our internal process. We do not investigate allegations of assault.
Thank you. Dan, Serena, anyone else want to chime in related to this question before we head over to the next one?
Sure. I would say for the Office of the Ombudsman, listening to Tammy Hogan speak really prompted and helped me see some of the similarities actually in how my team responds to instances of when families are calling around education related issues that are connected to sexual assault. We're using a lot of the same values. For us, when we process conflict resolution and de-escalation, but how to help get to resolution, it is very much centered around what is it that the family or the caller is saying that they need? What have they identified as important to them? It's not us telling them what to do. It's us discussing, here are some options, and we can evaluate pros and cons, and let us connect you to the people or the organizations who can help you do that next step. The way that we approach sexual assault is no different than the way that we approach any of the other cases that we work on. It is really that process of identifying feelings and values around what happened and helping to guide the family and inform them on the options that are available and process what they want to do next.
Thank you, Serena. Okay, so I'm going to transition to the next question. I see my ANC commissioner has chimed in or has logged in, Jamila White. But want to talk about now, how are reports of sexual assault handled? And I believe this is an area where some of the variance kind of goes into play. So actually, Jamila, if you're ready, I want to kind of toss it over to you a bit as oftentimes I know in our ward, folks will come to us as elected officials. And I know sometimes there's variance in how things are handled. So I want to kind of toss it over to you just to start related to, how do you process as a elected or a community partner? Because I think people don't even look at it as you're elected, look as you are a reliable source in the community to go to problems. How do you see the ANC role in responding to such incidents with students? And then I know some of our agency partners already mentioned how you handle it, but I think when it comes to community, sometimes there is variance because we don't know sometimes as community partners exactly who to go to. So Jamila, are you ready? I did a lot of talking to get you.
Yes, thanks, Carly.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone. I'm going to be honest. I have a 9 a.m. workout every Friday, so I can't get on camera because I still look like I finished that workout. But that's a great question, Carlene. And our community faces trauma on a daily basis. I mean, poverty is trauma, and we are in immense, poverty levels over here. And ANC commissioners, I'll speak very specifically, at least for AA. We get contacted for everything. We get contacted for fights at schools, assaults, incidents that happen on the way to school, because there's a lot of our students unfortunately experience a lot of violence and conflict on the way to school. Oftentimes it's, I'll say domestic, because it's between them or their peers or other people they know. And I'm thinking about a specific incident where a young lady was she was cut across her face by some other girls on the way to school very recently. And so when the families come to us, a lot of times they're in grief, they're in emotion, they're looking for someone to help. And they're like, we want you here. And we go to their houses. We show up at wherever the incident is to really talk to them. And so some of the things that I do immediately, of course, is get in touch with the principal or the school administration. Also tap into some local community organizations that I know do violence interruption work. Not just the violence interrupters from the city, but like community grassroots organizations that are trauma informed to help intervene and see what the family wants from that level. And of course, bring in the council member, because the incidents that happen in our community can spiral, right? And we have to try to contain them as much as possible so that it's not spiral. But just listening to this conversation, commissioners, we engage and interact so much with the community and contact support, blah, blah, really get into dealing with. And one of the agencies I go to quite often is DBH, and making sure they're brought into the situation, whatever it is. And so there's a big opportunity here to engagement about the resources, the processes, the services, and just make sure like commissioners are, trained in trauma-informed response and know that there are mandatory reporters and what is a mandatory reporter and all of these different things, because, we are dealing with that right at the grassroots level. And majority of us, except for those who, work in social services, just don't have that experience or that training. So we just kind of do what we always do, or what we know, or people who we know and reach out to. But there's a huge opportunity to improve that. And a lot of folks in the community, I'll just say, have at least been asking me, because I do a lot of organizing work. It's like, how do we start piloting restorative justice? How do we start looking at restoring some of the harm that's really just been done between people? And so there's a big opportunity to start integrating that. So I hope that, I know that didn't answer kind of directly.
No, actually, Commissioner White, that does help in regards to the mandated reporter piece. And that's what I was kind of getting to with an ANC commissioner, if they receive it at a certain level, what is the response? And I think you hit the nail on the head of, that you're a mandated reporter, but I just am curious if that could be a standard that all of our ANC commissioners, that is set for all of our ANC commissioners, and they know exactly who to report to.
I don't think so, Dr. Reed. I'm going to say I don't think so. I don't think that most of them know that we are mandatory reporters. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And yeah.
Cool. Anyone else would like to weigh in on? I know some of you already mentioned your agency's response.
Yeah, Oh, actually, let me weigh in. So I'm also an A&Z commissioner, but I'm going to take a different tact. I've been in the sexual assault community for 30 years of my life. And the first person I'm going to call is MPD. So 7 years ago, this October, my neighbor was violently raped by a serial rapist. He had raped everybody, including probably his mother and his sister. And he got my neighbor, and I made sure with MPD and DOJ that he went away for jail. He went away for 60 years, and he was 21. He had raped for years. I have zero tolerance for rape. That is a crime. So 60 years, he will stay in jail, and I will make sure he stays in jail for 60 years. There was an individual who used a fob, his girlfriend's fob, to rob and sexually abuse women at the Park Kennedy, 3 blocks from my house. He's going away for 68 months. I wrote the community impact statement. I have zero tolerance for sexual abuse. You touch a woman, you touch a man, you abuse them, there's no restorative justice in my mind. You're going to jail. So for me, what I tell my residents, you come to me if you have been abused, because the first phone call I'm going to make is to MPD, because we're going to prosecute. I'm not going to go to the school. We're going to prosecute, and you're going to jail. A slightly different tact, but a crime has been committed. And again, I have zero tolerance for sexual abuse at whatever age.
And I believe Commissioner Krupp, that actually goes into where we see some of the breakdown in procedure. I mean, I came from a school setting where the first step was you did not negotiate, you did not talk to, try to figure out if you reported. You reported to CFSA, you reported to MPD. Then you might let the school principal know. But I just am wary sometimes if those steps are followed about you report first, you don't. And actually, this might be a good time for Raina to chime in about what exactly should the steps be when an individual comes and says that, or a child comes and says that something inappropriate sexually has happened to me. I think that kind of level sets exactly what should be the steps. Raina.
Well, all school staff are mandated reporters. So just as you indicated, a call should be made. You can make a call to the hotline, but just as Ms. Kretz said, you can also contact the police. CFSA is most likely just the go-between, just gathering the information and forwarding it. But we do want to make sure that we have a record that it came in. But yes, definitely as mandated reporters. This is a sore spot for me, not even just with assault, but with child abuse and neglect, because sometimes school staff don't feel comfortable reporting. They may feel like they're doing something against the family because they know the family, but I just feel like if you're a mandated reporter, you should be reporting, even if you're not even certain. And if you contact our hotline, they'll walk you through the process, and then they'll inform you of the next step. So it's better to just report it, whether you go straight to MPD or go through us to go through MPD.
Thank you for that clarity.
You're welcome.
And I think that's something definitely we can iterate in our points and follow up, because I do think there is a level of sometimes investigation that happens, and people try to troubleshoot if should I not call. And I appreciate you both for iterating what the steps are for if something is reported. It's not to investigate, it's just to report. All right, thank you for everyone for chiming in related to policies and procedures. Moving into what resources and supports are available to students and staff who experience reports of sexual assault. And I want to talk about what we currently have, but I also like to talk about some things you would propose should be available that you might not be aware of. For instance, again, when I was assisting or got called in to assist with the case for Ward 8, I'm like, can the student just up and decide to move to another school? And then who supports that? And then what other creative resources could the student move to online learning for a period? Those, so basically what resources are available? And then are there any areas for potential resources? So I'll open that to anyone.
I guess I'll start. Oh.
No, please.
From my office's side, a lot of times how we get connected to sexual assault cases is after MPD has already been called, after like all the people and the players who are doing the investigation have already been contacted, and the family is looking for some type of education related connection, whether it's they want to transfer to a different school, or maybe they want the aggressor to transfer to a different school, or whether they need time at home to maybe just take a break from school for a little while, get connected to mental health supports. So all of those things have been available, I would say like broadly, but I would say like the process for requesting those things hasn't always been clear. It isn't always clear. And it really is. So when our office gets involved, it is like reaching out to the people that we know. I mean, there are other instances where safety transfers are warranted and are granted. So we're working to like pull the people together to get the plan in place based on what the family has articulated that they want, but also in understanding how the process works sort of internally, both I would say like on paper, but then also in practice, which is not always aligned. So we would be facilitating that on behalf of the family. I will also say some of the other ways that our office has been connected to sexual assault cases have been when the parents contacted us because the school called CFSA on them on multiple occasions. And in those cases, because of the confidentiality protections of my role and in the office, we are able to have these conversations with the school to get a sense of what they suspect is happening. And in some cases where the school suspected that an outside person connected to the family, not the parent, but someone on the outside who had access to the kids was potentially harming the kids, we were able to have a very frank conversation, like as a collective with the family, and it alerted to the parent that the children may be in danger. So I would say like our office is a resource to help with some of these conversations. We are, I would say, like a small part of the bigger resources that are available, but we are certainly here to help and facilitate some of those like uncomfortable conversations that teachers and school staff don't always want to have. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to Tammy to talk more about the vast resources that are available specifically for sexual assault.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say in terms of what we have available is counseling. Our advocacy, people under 17 and under typically go to Safe Shores, that the district's Children's Advocacy Center. So our counseling is there, and sometimes we do get looped in terms of coming up with a safety plan for children to remain in school versus have to do virtual learning, depending on, safety is subjective. So what we think may be safe for someone is not necessarily self-identified in that way. It depends on triggers. We look at it through that trauma-informed lens. But I think in terms of counseling, we're able to support with safety plan, with resourcing, with grounding, what you would do if you were triggered, what that looks like, communicating with the family at the behest, depending on what the survivor wants. But I think in terms of what I really wanted to chime in about our gaps is to what Serena said about sort of a plan that is identified as a resource that someone could go to, similar to an IEP or a 504. What kind of accommodation plan for safety in that way, physically and emotionally, that is available and at the ready for someone to sort of access in that way. So you don't have to necessarily come up and say, I was assaulted, I need access to this. Something that's in place, that's a blueprint, that you don't have to go into the detail about what happened to then determine that you're eligible, because it's that storytelling or that repeating that you have to then share that can be re-traumatizing as well. So I loved hearing what you were saying, Serena, that you have that confidentiality ability to have that and then advocate without having to say, this is what happened to me. And then an administrator who then knows somebody who knows somebody gets to hear that story that isn't bound by confidentiality in that way, that then becomes re-traumatizing and part of the harm, the system of harm that happens for survivors, if that makes sense.
Can I add a couple of things?
Sure.
One, I have witnessed what sexual assault has done to siblings. So when you start talking about resources, it's not just the victim, and victims will act out in ways that they'll be angry, they'll be upset, their grades are going to tank. They may turn to alcohol, they may turn to drugs, they may turn to harming themselves. They're doing that. Their siblings are watching this. Their siblings may do the same thing. So it has to be a comprehensive plan that not only helps the victim, the direct victim of sexual abuse in the school system, but also helps the siblings, because these siblings are also suffering from a second degree impact. If you got to think about the second degree impact when you're thinking about this. I'd also encourage the school system to think about the parents, because I've had enough conversations with fathers and mothers, but fathers whose sons have been sexually abused. And that is just, it's awful. I've had mothers crying, but the fathers, just the dead cold silence that you see in their eyes. And so it's got to be a comprehensive package. The package also has to look at retaliation. So, you know how I got into this world, or how I ended up being an ANC? I was fired for reporting sexual assault at the federal level 11 years ago. I was a federal agency chief counsel. I was responsible for one of the 5 federal schools, and I reported sexual abuse, and I was fired for doing that. So not only do I know about the K through 12 problem, I know about the college problem. And I share that because some of the stuff that's happening at the college level is also happening here. And one of those things is the lack of accountability. It's a lack of accountability of the incidents, it's a lack of accountability of prosecutions. And then the other thing that I'm seeing both at the college level and here is the retaliation that I suffered for reporting and that others are suffering. There is a fear of retaliation for reporting sexual assault. There's a fear for the victim of reporting. And then sometimes there's a fear for the teacher to report, because nobody wants to tarnish the school. So you got to think of it in those terms. And then you also have to layer on, what's the interest of the school when a parent or a teacher reports sexual assault? Will school leaders actually do the right thing? Or are they going to say, my goodness, my job's on the line, I don't want to report it? Their interests are not going to be the same as the parent. Their interests are not going to be the same interests as the students. It's a complex thing, so you got to pull it through. And you got to create a comprehensive package.
Speaking of the go, yes.
I just wanted to say, Denise, just so you know, at DC Rape Crisis Center, we have services for primary and secondary. So siblings, parents, friends, anyone that's in relationship with a primary survivor, you get free services too.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. I was gonna, because my question too was, I appreciate the comment about the comprehensive supports. I'm also curious about like the community supports, in the sense of, if I'm a community member who, I'll be frank, I have had a history related to sexual assault, and had to get the calls related to a student, and that put me in an interesting place, a pretty dark place, when having to, have the conversations and try to figure out what was going on. And so I'm curious, I know I was not the only one in my community who struggled with hearing the information, feeling their own sense of trauma, and then trying to support a community member. So I'm curious about what supports are available to community members who, especially like when you have an ANC commissioner who is, a community member themselves, like Commissioner White and Commissioner Crap, or for instance, advocates in our community. Those are people I was on phone with constantly, who were also, they hear these stories over and over again. What supports are available to community members who may be like frontline supports related to some of the cases, or families feel very comfortable coming and sharing some of those stories? So I'm curious. I know there's supports for family, but I wonder if what community supports are available. or is it
So
an opportunity?
for us, it's the same. So if you're in relationship with a primary survivor, it doesn't have to be bound by family. It doesn't have to be that because, and then for our staff too. So we look at that through the lens of vicarious trauma, which is part of our trauma-informed practices. So anything you can do to mitigate that. And it's a similar lens for secondary survivors. So how can you support yourself to be the best support for a primary survivor? So the services are designed that way.
Thank you. We have a lot of community members who are, anyone else? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Dan, okay.
I'm sorry, I wanted to pivot back to the previous question briefly. As you were talking about what would we want the system to look like or what we want the response to be. And for me, part of that system or part of what that response would look like, I would love for us to become more proactive about kind of reworking the culture, reworking kind of the norms that kind of allow for some of these behaviors, not behaviors, some of these criminal activities to occur. One of the things that we saw when we were talking to students, before the pandemic and at the beginning of last year was around street harassment and around just the level of street harassment students face as they go to and from school every day, and kind of the normalization of being catcalled, the normalization of being solicited, the normalization of being, of having unwanted touching and it just becoming normalized. We asked them, do you feel safe? And, baseline students, both males and females, predominantly said yes, all around 60-70% of them said yes. Then when we dug into it around kind of their experiences, almost around from, I think, in the second go around at the beginning of the school year, nearly 2 to 1, students that identified as female reported barriers getting to and from schools that's centered around street harassment, that's centered around being touched, being unwanted attention, observing, having observations, just going to and from school with the nexus that has some sort of sexual behavior from an unfamiliar adult. And so that is the communities and the culture that they're grown with. And so when these incidents occur in school buildings, they're it's normalizing, and there's no longer it's no longer registering as this is something that shouldn't be happening, and this and that leads to some dangerous escalation. And so as we think about kind of what the system should be, and kind of what the responses should be, we really need to think about how are we creating paths for our students to readjust these norms and kind of push back at these situations, be it bystander intervention training, be it sexual harassment, orientations earlier on for students, but really kind of reorienting the way students are experiencing schools and students are experiencing safety.
Thank you for that, Dan. Before I turn it over to Representative Gasley, I see has a question in the chat. Just quickly, I guess the big reason why we're called here, I think the heart of the State Board of Education resolution is related to data. Who collects data? Does your agency share data? And then any ideas about where should this information be so that community members, families, anyone connected to students can make decisions or at least be aware of this information. So the next question is, what data does your agency collect and or share with the public related to sexual assault in schools? And if you don't have an agency or where should this information be housed? Who should be responsible given the construct of education in our city? So turn it over to whoever wants to answer. Commissioner Krepp, I would imagine you'll be chomping.
Yes, I do. So, all right, I'm only going to be an ANC commissioner for 3 more months, and I have the data. So I would like to give it to you guys. I have the FOIA that has the 10 years worth of DCPS data. So I really want to give that to you. I have the MPD, I have the settlement data, and I actually have the settlement agreement that is associated with the male-on-male sexual abuse that occurred in a DCPS school. And I started asking some questions, and I encourage you to kind of continue to pull the thread. I asked the question of, well, if you entered into like a $75,000 settlement agreement, did you say that this individual could no longer teach in a DCPS school? And they said, no, why would we do that? Like, okay, well, is the teacher still teaching? You know, if you know that he's been doing, he's like, no, we don't know. Like, so if you're the State Board of Education, please ask these questions. Please ask and say, if DC government officials are entering into settlement agreements, then maybe you want to say, if we're paying $75,000, you're not teaching in DCPS and you're not going to have a DC teaching license. But you guys are the ones to ask the questions. I was just an ANC that was interested in this. And then I need you guys to also to be the ones that are going to continue the fight after I leave, with the US attorney going, what type of prosecutions have you done? I mean, I have been FOIAing for years, and I have data that's in 2016 and down, but I don't have the past 5 years, and I don't have the data that's specific on what cases did they prosecute related to the sexual abuse in DC schools. You guys could ask that as the State Board of Education. You could also go to the DC Council and say, hey, DC Council, every year DCPS is required to give you an annual update. Why aren't you asking for this? Why aren't you asking for them to be putting this in their annual report? And why aren't you asking for them to be sharing this online on their website? I would ask for redundancy. I'd put it on yours, and then I would put it on theirs. Make something redundant, but I have it and I will gladly give it to all of you. What else can I give you? I'm handing out info. What do you need?
I'll definitely take data. And actually, I know President Sutter has shared some of the points, hence why you ended up being invited, because it was an interesting preview. Because we knew that it was a bigger issue than, what Ward 2 and what I saw in 8. And it was just, I'm like, in our head, anytime we see one case, we know that there's more for anything. It could be a comment related to something that's going on, and usually that's just a comment that made it to us. We know usually that issue is probably more expansive. So it was interesting to see the Ward 2 article and what Councilmember Pinto did and Representative Chang, and then see Ward 8. And then here came this information related to, whoa, there are more schools, there are more cases. Seeing some of the data made it interesting, like, well, what happened? It was interesting to see students, staff, so definitely peeling into that more and asking more questions. So definitely following up related to data that you have already FOIA'd. Also, I'm sorry, I was looking at anyone else related to where should this information be housed? Does your agency collect data? Where should it be housed?
I can say, we don't collect it necessarily, but I can speak to the underreporting for various reasons. We've had, DCRCC has worked with DCPS for like 20 years, doing the prevention kind of work that Dan's talking about, like understanding from the youth what they need, and then looking at it from a consent-based culture point of view in terms of, what is normalized and validated, but is not appropriate or okay. Like what's socially accepted versus personally accepted. And so you go in and we have these conversations and you hear a lot about like, that's just what it is. And you hear staff say things too, that are kind of like really needing to understand the baseline of like what consent is, what my body, my choice, in terms of what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, and what is sort of socially accepted. And through those trainings or that engagement and education, there's a lot that goes on. And so I think that people rely on the definition of sexual assault being jurisdictionally in terms of what's prosecutable. And even relying on that way isn't always the best way, because to Denise's point, not everything gets prosecuted, even though it falls within the definition. And so looking at it in terms of consent and what is non-consensual has happened is sort of the way that we approach it and look at it. And we don't collect it or report on it, but we sort of understand it through that lens, if that makes sense. That I think maybe DCPS has certain standards, but really understanding what the definition is subjectively for youth versus jurisdictionally, and how they sort of prevent and then intervene across that spectrum, if that makes sense. I'm sort of talking in broad strokes, but I'm trying to widen the perspective that it doesn't have to be just prosecutable, because even if it is, it doesn't necessarily go the distance. And so really looking at it, if you're going to look at it in terms of impact and traumatic impact on youth and what they're accustomed to or what's normalized for them, to Dan's point, it's very important to listen to them and see, and what they may think is like, oh, that just happens, but is that okay? And how does that impact you walking to school, going into class, being in a crowded hallway where people are brushing by you and touching you, or, you know, if you've experienced that trauma, that has impact on you to be touched and touched without consent. And so, yeah.
That's helpful.
So let me add on to that.
Okay. And then I'm going to hop over there.
Yeah, no. So you have to break it down. So in my role as a federal agency chief counsel, it taught me that not all cases are prosecuted. So we just heard that they're not. See, what you have to do is ask how many incidents there were, then break it down to how many reports, then how many were investigated, how many were referred for prosecution, how many were declined for prosecution, how many were prosecuted, and then how many resulted in jail time. I was amazed as a federal agency chief counsel how many times a prosecutor declined to prosecute. Like, what do you want me to do? Gift wrap this for you? I mean, I've got everything. I have a crime. I have a victim. I have a narrative, and you're not going to prosecute. So you have to break it down, because the number of incidents versus the number of people going to jail, they're not the same. So please just keep asking questions.
Thanks for that breakdown. I want to go to
and so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No,
I just wanted the reason why I brought that up is just a measure or a standard for DCPS to determine what is sexual assault, what makes you eligible for accommodations, what, to the point that Serena and I were sort of talking about earlier, is that looking at that, because that tends to be an issue of, did the assault happen? Did it qualify as sexual assault by jurisdictional or legal standards? What does that mean for DCPS in terms of getting accommodations? And what does that mean in terms of reporting and eligibility? Do you need to report to have that happen? Does that, like, what that whole complex system, to your point, Carlene, that you said at the beginning with the complexities about the agenda, is what does that look like in terms of someone reporting, or someone reporting to someone just to get accommodations at school who may not want to go through the legal system, in spite of the fact that we're all mandated reporters. But what does that look like in terms of getting the individual, their needs addressed, and what hoops do they have to jump through to get those needs addressed? And what definitions do they have to follow to have eligibility apply to then get those services, to get those needs addressed?
That's helpful. And I think that's a helpful framing for our city, because I worry how many students might not feel that they were supported because maybe their definition, their report, whatever it was, didn't meet somebody's threshold for activating accommodations, which I think is even more detrimental to some of the long-term effects that were named today. So yes. I want to bounce over to Representative Gasley, because it's a totally different question that wasn't on the agenda. But Representative Gasley, you want to ask your question?
I have two. I actually, no, I just wanted to ask, based on what you were talking about, Commissioner Krepp, and thank you for your work, for all of you, the work that you do. So I just wanted to get some clarity around if a case is settled versus prosecuted, or actually, the perpetrator is prosecuted. does that person then, like if they go through the background check with DCPS, would that not show up what they were accused of?
It depends. It really depends on whether or not DCPS registered that settlement somewhere. So
Oh,
the only reason I found out about that settlement agreement is every couple of years I've been asking for settlement agreements. And so up to this year, there had never been one involving DCPS. And then all of a sudden it popped up and I was like, whoa, wait a second, where'd this one come from? Because there had been Department of Corrections, there had been MPD and DCPS. So that's when I pulled the thread and said, what is this case? So if you don't ask the question, they're not going to tell you.
because
So
it's not in their interest. It doesn't make them look good. Is that
right?
your?
Oh, yes. So you're going to have to ask on a yearly basis, has the city, and by the way, it's not DCPS you have to ask, it's the Attorney General's office, because the Attorney General's office is the one that's doing the settlement agreements. So you'll have to ask him or her.
Why would they, the OAG be, they don't have an interest in keeping this quiet, right? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is ideally, if we had a system where there weren't these disconnects, what would it look like and who would be, I mean, it seems like what I'm hearing you say is even if the school folks do their due diligence and they report,
Mhm.
then there's not a cycle back where they find out what happened with
Correct.
that perpetrator, right? And so
Right.
then that perpetrator could show up again.
Yes.
Right. So there should be a system where they're blocked from being employed again or entering the building again. That list, where would it come from? Right? Like who would report back to DCPS or whatever LEA or Catholic school? There should be like, first of all, it sounds like there should be one for the whole system, not these broken up. Right. And
I agree with you. So
yeah.
there's two people that you would have to go to, but you only have ability to really talk to one. So the DC Office Attorney General will tell you about the settlements,
Mhm.
and you have some political power there. But it's the US Attorney that prosecutes the cases at the criminal level, and he or she has not been forthcoming in information. So if you as the State Board of Education want to send a letter to the US Attorney and say, we would like you to start sharing this information, I would then put it on social media and I would cite some of these cases going, we think it's in the city's interest for you to start sharing this information and putting it on your website. Because we're different from every other entity in the United States. We don't have an elected AG. We don't have an elected prosecutor. We have a US attorney.
Yeah, but it sounds like to close the loop in a way that actually would make a difference in school.
Mhm.
It wouldn't just be putting it on a website where it's public. That's good. But it sounds like, because you're not going to have principals looking at that website. They don't have the bandwidth
Right.
that you need that to be like part of the systematic hiring process, that when they do a background check, which they do, that
Mhm.
this would come up, that it's somehow linked to that website, right?
So I would do it twofold. In your the hiring paperwork, I would say, have you ever entered into a settlement agreement related to sexual assault? So I would put it on the applicant first. Have you ever been accused or convicted of sexual abuse? Have you ever entered into a settlement agreement regarding sexual abuse? So I would do it with the applicant. And then I would go to DCPS and go, are you tracking this information? Because they have a role here as the ones employing this, because that's where their legal liability is. Are you doing your due diligence? How do you know that these individuals have not been convicted or entered into settlement agreements? And then go to the US Attorney's office and go, what are you doing? Because you too also now, because of this, there was an interesting case, and it's actually related to the gun law cases. So the Air Force ended up having entered into a settlement agreement, a gun case, because they knew somebody was a problem. They didn't put anything into the background check, and that individual ended up shooting people. Well, if the U.S. Attorney's Office knows that they've prosecuted an individual and that person's going to jail, and that person then comes out of jail, but nobody knows that he went to jail for sexual abuse, and he goes to another school and does it again, it's on that U.S. attorney.
Yeah. So why are they not being forthcoming? I mean, it's not in their interest, right? Like, I understand DC for the other.
You would be amazed at the conversations I've had with the U.S. attorney. His response, and I quote, in March was, "You don't reasonably expect me to know all the cases I'm prosecuting." I asked him if he knew how many rapes, murders, and armed carjackings his office was prosecuting each year, and he said no.
So it's maybe, okay, like, all right, I don't want to take up all the airtime.
You're asking the right questions. You are asking the correct questions.
I do want you have a question in the chat about the minors reported being perpetrators, and huh?
Can I ask that now, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, that's what I thought. That was the question you were gonna ask.
Then I got, interested.
Yes, go ahead.
So I guess, there's some really clear cases where you have an adult who is abusing a minor or an adult abusing another adult. That's super clear. And I am totally on board with, prosecution, everything you said, Commissioner Krepp, and everyone else. I guess where I think, and I know this is true for other educators, people working in schools, where it gets dicey and they may not be reporting. And so it's really important that we get clarity on this, is when there's a minor, it's a minor on minor abuse, right? And so I think it's not clear to adults in schools often what happens if I report this 8-year-old, right, who is displaying very inappropriate and, sometimes violent behavior, but may also be, because they're so young, you can imagine that maybe they are emulating what they see, or they have themselves been abused. Like, I think they want to know, am I going to really ruin this child's life? And I think I just want to put it out there that, especially for Black boys, we know that they are criminalized at very young ages for behavior that sometimes is viewed as like overly aggressive. And so I think there's a hesitancy on the part of some adults to report that, but they don't know what to do. So I guess I'd be interested to hear if there is a different process for minors who are reported, what happens next for them.
And I'll be curious to hear from CFSA for this one, as well as the DC Rape Crisis Center. So if either you want to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in. Essentially, if it is a concern that the child is being physically or sexually abused, then it would be something that we would investigate at our agency. But we would also work in conjunction with YD as well. And so we would work to make sure that that child is safe. And then if it is an assault, then YD would take that up. But yes, if it was sexual abuse, we can investigate by a caretaker.
Can I just clarify, you're saying, so YD is youth?
I call it, I've been here for a long time, so I call it it's Youth Family Services Division of Metropolitan Police Department.
When you say they would ensure that the child is safe, you're talking about both kids, the one who's and the accused abuse.
Not an assault, but from your question, it was if we are concerned that this child may be abused sexually by a caretaker, that is something that we would investigate at our agency. Yes.
But I guess I'm just going to push it a little bit. So I'll just give you a scenario. Let's say there's an 8-year-old boy who has been reported for exposing himself and touching other children in his class. What happens when I, as the teacher, report him? What happens to him? That's what I want to know.
Well, every situation is different, but once the call is made to the hotline, then we have a hotline process where we review all investigations or all reports, and it's determined whether it would be accepted or not. In some circumstances, based on the information, it has been accepted, and we will go out to do an assessment with that child. Work with, like I said, Youth Family Services Division of the police department to possibly do a forensic interview at Safe Shores, which is one of our community partners. So if it is a concern that this child is being sexually abused from a caregiver, that is something that we can investigate.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand. There would be follow-up, and part of that follow-up, once you've done some initial investigating, if there were any indications that this child who's been reported is also a victim, then there would be that. So there is an intentional attempt to understand that, like what's happening.
Oh, absolutely. Every report is not just accepted at the hotline, but we do have a process where we're really taking a look at the information and determining what is the best pathway, whether it's a referral or to the appropriate agency, which would be Youth and Family Services, the MPD, or if it would be something that CFSA would respond to. And if we have a child that is possibly being sexually abused in the home or by a caretaker who is providing care for that child, that is something that we would definitely respond to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think the key is report.
Report. I can't say that enough. I know sometimes mandated reporters do feel uncomfortable, as I stated earlier, but you really have to take the onus off of yourselves and just think about what could be possibly going on with that child. And it does feel uncomfortable. I've been in both roles as I am a mandated reporter, but not working through this agency. And it is an uncomfortable feeling, but we have to make sure that we are reporting anything that we feel maybe behaviors that have changed, something that is said, as it was stated, sexualized behaviors. Like if you're not sure or if you're uncertain, just report and we can take it from there.
I know we are getting close to time. I do want to allow everyone kind of a round robin of any key takeaways, I guess, for the State Board of Education in our role as the voice of education in the city on the topic of sexual assault in schools, that you all want, any tidbits you want to leave us with, and then any action steps you wish to take. And then I just ask on the other end of this not be our last conversation with you all. And as we move forward in the work, we look forward to leaning heavily on you as agency and community partners. So I'm gonna go the reverse of how I started. Commissioner White, are you still there?
I am. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, and the rest of the State Board of Education for pulling this together. I think it's just so much information that has been shared, and getting that out to the community as much as possible would be extremely helpful. There's like I said, a huge opportunity for a lot of training and knowledge and awareness to just be brought to ANC commissioners, to other community organizations that interact so much with our youth, so that we can just be a lot more supportive. And so really look forward to partnering with you, Dr. Reed, and trying to make sure that the ANCs here in Ward 8 and other grassroots community organizers are aware of procedures and get the necessary resources we need to support our youth and protect them.
Thank you, Commissioner White. Raina Bailey Smith.
Thank you. Sorry. I just want to say that, as I stated before, unfortunately, we are not the investigators of sexual assault, but we do work in conjunction with Youth and Family Services Division of MPD. But as I want to keep stressing, we do have a mandated reporter process. And I just wanted to also state that if there is a need for mandated reporter training, you can just shoot your information to me in the chat, and I can forward that to someone in the agency who will respond, because we do provide mandated reporter training for you. And that training is wonderful if you haven't had it before. It goes into depth about what is reported, the process, and identifying who mandated reporters are, because some people think that they are not mandated reporters when they actually are. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Dan Davis, our Chief Student Advocate.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Reed and Dr. Sutter for having this conversation today. As I think about the role SBOE plays in our educational landscape here, I think there's an opportunity to kind of ramp up maybe some of our health standards to incorporate some of the training that DC Rape Crisis Center has and training that some of the state shores has around just becoming more preventative and giving resources to schools and the tools to schools so they can kind of incorporate a new norming and kind of trying to balance some of the things that are occurring outside of the school building. So I think that may be a pathway that can be explored later down the road. I know there's a lot on you guys' plates, but yeah.
Yes, that's what we're here for, though. Thank you, Dan. Tammy Hogan from DC Rape Crisis Center.
I'm grateful to be a part of the conversation and hearing from everybody and understanding the complexities. It's really important. And then the needs, or how to address the needs of the survivor. And similar to what Dan said about training, and Safe Shores has a great one called Darkness to Light. That's great for everybody to take, people to understand what their mandated reporting responsibilities are, and just that, healing and support is unique to the individual, and to really understand that. And it's not a one size fits all. And just some sort of standard for people to know along the sort of continuum of prevention to intervention, set a standard and what's necessary to meet those standards. And then, retrofit any supports that are needed for schools or providers or teachers to then meet those standards. Because it's easy to sort of say, this is what you need to do, but what does that look like operationally? And then what do you need from us to do that, to support you, so then you can then support the survivor? Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for centering the conversation so much related to the trauma-informed approach. It was a great balance to have, so thanks for participating. Commissioner Krupp.
I want to say thank you for inviting me, and I want to encourage you to use your names and also your titles. You are the State Board of Education. Let me repeat that. You are the State Board of Education. Use it. You have the positional power to inspire people. You know, the ability to hold people accountable. So I ask you to do that. I ask you to do that via social media. Please tweet about what just happened today. Put out a press release about what you're going to do. Tell them you're going to hold them accountable. And by doing that, you're going to encourage people to come to you and seek assistance. Because that's what's needed here. I mean, I've been in this world for 30 years. It's not a world I wanted to be in. Nobody walks into this world because you want to be in this one. But you're put in this world for a whole variety of reasons. So how do we make sure that there are fewer people that walk in these worlds? How do we make sure that there are fewer victims? Please use your titles as individual State Board of Education reps. Please your title as an entity. And please hang all the information that you have on your website so that people know what's been going on. Because that's been part of the problem. Nobody knew. Nobody knew to the extent to which the problems were occurring. And so, the Washington Post has a little slogan that says, democracy dies in darkness. Yeah, well, there's a lot of crime that happens in darkness too. So please shine a light on this one and just keep on shining it, ladies. So thank you.
Thank you for being here, Commissioner Krupp, and taking up the issue, as well as the years of data that you've collected, as well as being willing to share those data with us, and for your time this afternoon. or still morning, but this Friday morning. Greatly appreciate it. Serena Hayes, Ombudsman for Public Education.
Thanks. Again, I do want to say thank you for allowing me to be a participant today, but also just to say that, our office is a resource. I mean, a lot of times when people think about sexual assault, they're not always thinking about the education, even when it does happen in schools, they're not always thinking about the related educational impact. And even if it's not a call that's made, in the immediate first moment of crisis, as it shouldn't be, please call the police, or connect with someone who can be the crisis intervention, the DC Rape Crisis Center. But we're here really to help bridge the gap on any barriers that come up related to education, regardless of what the originating issue actually is, including sexual assault.
Thank you, Serena, for always being a partner in the work. And always, as much as I can publicly thank you for being a reliable source when we have parents call, knowing that we can turn over to you and Dan to be followed up with. And I like always reiterate, it's case management for our families. And to date, I have not had a family come back and say they were not pleased. So thank you for the work that you do. I do want to make sure we leave also my colleagues, Representative Sutter and Gasley, I want you all to have a couple statements, but I definitely want to turn over to our DC Rape Crisis Center to provide information for folks who are listening, to be sure that they know how to access that resource, as well as also for CFSA, that hotline information, before I turn the mics over to Representative Zoe and President Sutter. Just want to make sure our community in the meantime is informed of how to report and how to access services. So I'm going to CFSA first for reporting, and then support with Rape Crisis Center.
Thank you. I can put the hotline number in the chat if that's okay with everyone.
I'm on mute.
Can
I'll
you-
read it out
okay.
loud, or you can provide it out loud, because we have people who are watching on YouTube that can't see our chat.
No problem. 202-671-SAFE.
It's 202-671-SAFE. Thank you so much for reporting. You can access that number. And for Tammy Hogan, for community members, families to access services related to the topic.
Yes, so in terms of training and education, we have that. We also do crisis intervention. We're happy to come out and do trainings for schools. We already do a DCPS for consent-based culture and how to respond, trauma-informed practices, and all of that. But you can, for training and education, you can email indira@dcrcc.org. I can put that in the chat. And our hotline, which is 24/7 confidential and anonymous, it's 202-333-7273. And that if you're interested in any services for primary or secondary survivors, you can call our clinical services coordinator, who is Sabrina Rock. And she's an LMFT, or a clinician also at our agency. And her phone number is 202-470-1188. So I'll put this all in the chat too for everybody, but we can help with all of the above. And our services are free.
And we'll be sure to, in our follow-up communications, list out those services for folks to be able to access. Okay, so turning it over to my colleagues for final words. Representative Gasoy, I'll start with you, and I'll end with President Sutter.
Great. I just want to say thank you again for taking time to be with us today, and for all of the information that you've shared. We will definitely go forward. I will also just say there's always a sense of urgency around, especially issues of, keeping our students safe. But I am glad that we paused and had this panel, because the information that we've gleaned from all of you is really important. It also makes us realize that there's just a lot of work to be done. So again, just gratitude for all that you do all the time, and for sharing that expertise and experience with us.
I appreciate all of you taking your time today to join us, and I apologize for being off camera for a little while. I want to say, in addition to all of the gratitude for the information you've provided, a particular thanks on helping the board do something I think we try to do for the public, which is to understand and get our hands around just how complex issues are for so many students and families in DC, and then to try to like really deeply understand it ourselves so that we can make a little bit simpler for the public how they can interact with these complex systems. So I think we started there with all the different pieces of different legislation, different systems that don't always talk to each other. What I'm walking away from today is that we need to make sure that families know and that victims know how to get help for what they're experiencing in the moment. And then we as a board need to think about how we better simplify these connections in these complex systems to make transparent what data is possible to make transparent to the public, and to make a little bit easier the ways in which agencies can interact so that families don't have to take that complexity on themselves. Serena and I've talked about this before. We want any door to be the right door for a person seeking help. And we want the work to happen on the back end so that it's not a burden on the victims or their families, but rather a burden that the system takes up on their behalf. So I'm grateful to all of you for helping us learn enough today that it gets us thinking further on this work, and lay out an agenda for us of what we have to do next to make that possible. Thank you so much for helping us learn and for being here with us today.
Thank you all. And with that, we will conclude today's roundtable, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all as partners. Have a good day.
Is somebody capturing the chat? I mean, like.
It's okay. I stopped recording. I recorded. Ooh. Oh wait, we're still live streaming. 1 second.